One basketball play, 2 seconds of contact, and a single social media post that turned a routine ejection into one of the most explosive controversies the WNBA has seen all season. By the time the final buzzer sounded, nobody was talking about the score anymore. They were talking about DiJonai Carrington, Sophie Cunningham, and a tweet that quite literally changed the entire conversation mid-game. If you think you already know this story, you probably only know half of it, because what happened on that court was just the beginning. Let's get into it. The Chicago Sky and the Indiana Fever were already locked in an intense matchup when the moment happened. Sophie Cunningham was pushing ahead on a fast break, open court, full speed, eyes on the basket. She went up for the layup, drew the foul, and completed the play. But the contact that came with it wasn't the kind referees wave off and move on from. DiJonai Carrington came in from behind and made high contact, the kind that makes you wince even watching it back on replay. Cunningham went down. The whistle blew, and what followed wasn't a simple foul call, it was a full review. Officials pulled the play and examined it frame by frame. What they determined was that the contact wasn't just hard, it was unnecessary, it was excessive. And under WNBA rules, that combination means one thing: Flagrant 2, automatic ejection. Carrington's night was over before most fans had even finished processing what they'd just seen. And here's what's interesting about that part of the story. Fever coach Stephanie White supported the decision. She agreed the call was correct, but she also made a point of saying she didn't believe Carrington acted with deliberate malicious intent. That distinction matters more than people give it credit for. Dangerous contact and deliberate intent to injure are not the same thing. Professional basketball moves at a speed most people can't fully appreciate from the stands. Players make split-second decisions constantly, and sometimes those decisions go wrong in ways that have serious consequences. That's exactly why the flagrant foul rules exist in the first place. The rules aren't designed only for players who want to hurt someone. They exist because certain types of contact are dangerous regardless of what was going on inside the player's head. So by the letter of the rules, the ejection was clean, reviewable, defensible, and supported even by the opposing coach. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a story for about 12 hours. A highlight clip, some debate, and then on to the next game. But Carrington didn't go quietly to the locker room, and that's where everything shifted. This is the part that took a basketball controversy and launched it into a completely different dimension. After being ejected and walking off the court, DiJonai Carrington did something that nobody saw coming. While the game was still being played, while her teammates were still on the floor, she picked up her phone and posted 2 words directed at the Indiana Fever: white privilege. That's it. No explanation, no context, no elaboration, just those 2 words posted from inside the building while the clock was still running on the game she'd just been removed from. The reaction was immediate, and it was massive. Within minutes, the post was being screenshotted, reposted, and debated across every sports platform you can name. And here's why the timing made it so much more explosive than the foul itself. Because a flagrant 2 ejection is something people can discuss using basketball language. Angles, contact, rules, precedent. People can disagree, but there's a framework. The moment you introduce a racial accusation into the conversation, the entire framework changes. Now it's not about the play anymore. Now it's about officiating bias, about how players are treated differently, about whether the league protects certain athletes over others. Those are serious claims, and serious claims require serious evidence. The problem was that the post came without any of that. No specifics, no context, no explanation of exactly what Carrington believed happened or why she believed it. Just the accusation, dropped into the internet like a match into gasoline, while the game she was supposed to be playing in continued without her. Some fans immediately understood it as an emotional reaction from an athlete who felt she'd been treated unfairly. Others saw it something harder to defend, a public accusation made in the heat of the moment without the kind of support that a claim like that genuinely requires. And a significant number of people, particularly those who'd been watching Cunningham's season closely, saw it through an entirely different lens, because Sophie Cunningham didn't arrive at this controversy without her own baggage, and that context is something you can't separate from this story. Before the Carrington foul happened, Sophie Cunningham was already one of the most polarizing players in the league, not because of anything that happened on the court, but because of what she'd been saying off it.
Cunningham made strong public comments earlier this year about transgender athletes competing in women's sports. She didn't soften her position, she didn't walk it back. She stated her view clearly and openly. And the response was exactly what you'd expect in 2026, split completely down the middle. A significant portion of fans rallied behind her. Another portion was furious. Protests and public demonstrations tied to that broader debate had already followed her into arenas. The WNBA itself had been navigating the larger cultural conversation connected to that issue, and Cunningham had become one of its most visible and most debated figures. So, when Carrington's foul happened, it didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of an ongoing cultural argument that millions of people were already emotionally invested in. Fans who had strong opinions about Cunningham's comments brought those opinions into their reaction to the foul. Fans who supported Cunningham's stance were predisposed to see Carrington's play as an attack. Fans who opposed Cunningham's stance were predisposed to frame the whole thing differently. Neither group was necessarily looking at just the basketball play anymore. They were looking at it through the filter of everything that had been building for months. That's why one flagrant foul became national news within hours. The contact might have generated a day of sports debate in a different season, with different players, in a different environment. But the environment surrounding the WNBA right now isn't neutral. It hasn't been for a while. And Cunningham, whether she intended it or not, had already positioned herself at the center of the league's most heated ongoing conversation. What happened on that fast break simply gave people another reason to argue about something they were already arguing about. Cunningham's own response to the foul was notably measured. She confronted Carrington on the court. Her teammates and staff stepped in before it could escalate, and afterward she called the contact unnecessary. But she also made clear she wasn't interested in turning it into a bigger spectacle. She rejected the suggestion that the officiating decision was racially motivated. In fact, she pointed out something significant. She herself had previously been ejected for a similar type of foul. That's an uncomfortable detail for anyone who wants to make the narrative entirely about race and selective officiating. It doesn't resolve every question about how the league handles these situations, but it does complicate the story considerably. And that complication is worth sitting with, because this story has several layers that get lost the moment people pick a side and stop listening. Here's a question that started circulating almost immediately after the ejection. Is this who DiJonai Carrington has always been on the court? Because the Cunningham play wasn't the first time her name had come up in connection with controversial contact. Last season, during a Fever Sky matchup, a clip went viral of Carrington appearing to poke Caitlin Clark in the eye while trying to deflect a pass. Clark was attempting to throw the ball to Aaliyah Boston. Carrington's hand came in and made contact with Clark's eye. No foul was called. Clark had to take a moment to recover her composure before play continued. It wasn't flagged, it wasn't reviewed, and it moved on. But it didn't go unnoticed. Fans who were already watching every interaction involving Clark documented it, clipped it, and kept talking about it long after the game ended. There was also an incident in the same matchup where Clark hit Carrington in the head, knocking out one of her contacts. Again, no foul called. Carrington had to pause and put her contact back in before continuing. That moment generated far less discussion, which some people pointed to as evidence of inconsistency in how incidents involving Clark tend to get covered.
What both incidents tell you when you put them next to the Cunningham Flagrant 2 is that Carrington plays with a physicality that has repeatedly placed her in the middle of high-profile controversial moments. That's not a conclusion about intent, it's just an observable pattern. Whether the league views that pattern as something requiring stronger action is a separate question, and it's one that the WNBA's disciplinary process will presumably address. What was confirmed following the Cunningham incident is that Carrington has been suspended by the league. The details of the length and official reasoning were reported, but the core fact is that action was taken. Many fans and commentators had been calling for exactly that, particularly those who felt that repeated instances of hard contact involving the same player should carry cumulative consequences. There's a legitimate argument there. Professional sports leagues exist partly to protect players from contact that goes beyond competitive intensity into something genuinely dangerous. And when a pattern emerges around a specific player, it's reasonable to ask whether the standard response is sufficient.
But there's also a counter-argument worth acknowledging. Physical play is part of basketball. Hard fouls happen. Drawing firm conclusions about a player's character or intent based on a series of moments, some of which were never even penalized, risks crossing from analysis into something less fair. The officials made no call on the Clark eye poke. Does that mean Carrington got away with something? Or does it mean the officials didn't see it as crossing a line in real time? Those are different conclusions, and conflating them doesn't serve anyone trying to actually understand the situation. What's fair to say is this: Carrington now has a documented history of controversial physical plays at the highest level of women's basketball. The league suspended her, and whatever she does next will be watched very closely, both on the court and on social media. Let's be precise here, because this is the part of the story where the most misinformation has already spread. What is documented, DiJonai Carrington posted white privilege directed at the Indiana Fever during the game from the locker room. That is confirmed. That is real. That happened. And it opened a genuine debate about whether race plays a role in how players and fouls are handled in the WNBA. A debate that, to be clear, some people engage with in good faith and some people engage with in very bad faith. What is not established that the officials ejected Carrington because Cunningham is white. That's a claim. It's a serious one, and as of right now, there is no credible evidence supporting it. Cunningham herself said so. She pointed to her own ejection history as evidence that the standard being applied wasn't selectively targeted at Carrington. That doesn't end every possible argument about officiating consistency across the league. Those conversations are worth having, and they're complicated. But it does mean that framing this particular rejection as racially motivated requires more support than a two-word tweet posted in an emotional moment. There's also been significant circulation online of claims suggesting that DiJonai Carrington directly threatened Cunningham in a follow-up post or message. That is a more serious allegation, and one that cannot be verified through reliable reporting. What was clearly reported and confirmed is the white privilege post. A direct threat is a different category of claim. Presenting it as established fact when it hasn't been verified through credible sourcing doesn't add to the story, it distorts it. And once a story starts getting distorted, once words like threatened and targeted and attacked start getting attached to something without evidence, people's understanding of what actually happened gets replaced with something much more dramatic and much less accurate. That matters, because there are real conversations worth having here. Questions about whether the WNBA officiates consistently across different types of players. Questions about how emotional reactions from athletes should be handled on social media. Questions about what responsibility a player has when they make a public accusation. Those conversations deserve honesty. They don't need embellishment. And the situation was already dramatic enough on its own merits, without anyone adding details that haven't been confirmed. Here's the honest read. Carrington expressed a feeling. Whether that feeling was rooted in a genuine experience of unequal treatment, or whether it was an emotional reaction that didn't hold up under scrutiny, is something only she fully knows. Athletes are human beings. They feel things intensely, especially in high-stakes competitive moments. Getting ejected from a game while your team is still on the floor, watching the play get upgraded on replay, hearing the crowd react, that's a lot happening in a very short period of time. People say things in those moments that they might phrase differently if given a few hours to process. But being emotional doesn't make an accusation true, and expressing a frustration publicly doesn't automatically make it accurate. Those are the two things social media constantly blurs together, and in this case, it blurred them almost instantly. This is a conversation that goes well beyond Carrington and Cunningham, but this situation illustrates it about as clearly as anything that's happened in women's sports this year. Professional athletes in 2026 have something no previous generation of players had: direct, instant, unfiltered access to millions of people. No press conference, no media filter, no publicist review. One unlocked phone, and whatever they're feeling in that moment can be in front of the entire sports world before the second half starts. That's an extraordinary amount of power. It's also an extraordinary amount of risk.
Because once you post, you don't own the story anymore. The internet does. Your two words become someone else's headline. Your emotional reaction becomes a clip in someone else's video. Your frustration becomes a debate between strangers who've never met you, don't know your history, and have no incentive to be fair to you. Some will defend you completely. Some will destroy you completely. And the thing you actually meant, the nuance, the context, the specific feeling you were trying to express, gets buried almost immediately beneath everyone else's interpretation. Carrington's post is a perfect example of exactly that dynamic. 2 words, that's all it was, and those 2 words generated days of debate, a wave of commentary from sports media personalities, counter-statements from the player she fouled, and almost certainly contributed to the speed and severity of the league's disciplinary response. It's impossible to know how the story would have developed if she'd simply walked to the locker room and said nothing. Maybe people would still be debating the foul itself. Maybe the conversation would have stayed on the basketball. But the post guaranteed that the conversation moved somewhere much more volatile. And here's the thing. The WNBA is under a level of scrutiny it has never experienced before. The league's audience has grown dramatically. Star players have mainstream profiles in a way that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Every moment inside that league, every foul, every sideline interaction, every post-game interview, every tweet gets amplified to a degree that was simply not true for the WNBA of previous eras. That's an incredible opportunity for the sport. It also comes with a weight that players are still learning how to carry. And that's not a criticism. It's genuinely new territory. There's no playbook for how to handle being one of the most watched athletes in a league that's going through the biggest cultural moment in its history, while also navigating a sport that's physically demanding and emotionally intense, while also having a social media account that never turns off. Most of these players are in their 20s. Most of them built their platforms authentically and organically. The idea that they're now expected to manage every public statement like a veteran PR professional is worth pushing back on. But the reality is that the standard exists whether it's fair or not, and the consequences of getting it wrong are very real. One thing this situation has exposed, and it's something that comes up in virtually every major WNBA controversy, is how quickly fans abandon consistency the moment their preferred player is involved. Carrington supporters looked at the ejection and saw selective officiation. They looked at the post and saw a player speaking her truth. They minimized the foul and amplified the grievance. Cunningham supporters looked at the ejection and saw a justified call. They looked at the post and saw an unfounded accusation. They amplified the foul and dismissed the grievance. Almost nobody did what's actually the harder thing: hold both players to the same standard simultaneously. Because here's what consistency actually looks like in this situation. If you're going to argue that Carrington's past physical plays demonstrate a dangerous pattern that the league needs to address, you also have to acknowledge that Cunningham has had her own controversial moments on the court, including a high-profile flagrant foul situation that generated significant attention.
She's not a saint just because she was on the receiving end of this particular play. She's a competitive professional athlete with her own history and her own edge. And if you're going to defend Carrington's tweet as an expression of genuine frustration, you also have to acknowledge that the post made a serious public accusation without evidence. Feeling something strongly is not the same as that thing being true. And a platform with reach means responsibility, even when you're angry, and even when the anger is justified. The standard cannot be, "My player did it, so it was fine." The standard has to be, was the action within the rules, was the accusation supported by evidence, and were all parties held to the same expectation of accountability? When fans apply that standard selectively, they don't just fail the players they claim to dislike, they fail the players they claim to support by creating an environment where no one can ever be held genuinely accountable for anything. The WNBA is too important a league right now to let tribal loyalty replace actual analysis. And moments like this one, as messy and complicated as they are exactly when that distinction matters most. Let's bring it back to the facts, because in a story this loud, the facts are easy to lose.
DiJonai Carrington committed a high foul on Sophie Cunningham during a fast break. Officials reviewed the play and upgraded it to a flagrant 2. Carrington was ejected. Cunningham reacted on the court and confronted Carrington before staff intervened. Following the ejection, Carrington posted "white privilege" directed at the Indiana Fever from the locker room mid-game. That post immediately escalated the controversy from a basketball debate into a much larger cultural argument. The WNBA confirmed a suspension for Carrington. Cunningham rejected the racial bias framing and pointed to her own ejection history as context. Claims of direct threats made by Carrington online have circulated, but have not been verified through reliable reporting and should not be treated as established fact. That's the story, and honestly, it's already a big one. It doesn't need anything added to it. What comes next depends on several things. How the league handles Carrington going forward, not just this suspension, but whether the broader pattern of physical play around her gets addressed with any kind of cumulative consequence. How Carrington responds publicly, whether she clarifies her position, doubles down, or simply lets the situation settle. How Cunningham continues navigating a complicated public position with the measured approach she showed here. And how the WNBA itself manages the reality that its growing platform means every controversy hits harder and travels farther than it ever did before. The bigger question underneath all of this isn't really about Carrington or Cunningham as individuals. It's about what kind of league the WNBA wants to be as it enters this new chapter of visibility and relevance. Does it apply its rules consistently regardless of who's involved? Does it take seriously the responsibility that comes with having players who have massive social platforms? Does it create an environment where athletes feel they can express genuine grievances through appropriate channels rather than reactive social media posts and actually be heard? Those aren't questions with easy answers, but they're the questions this controversy forces into the open. And forcing the right questions into the open, even through messy, uncomfortable moments, is sometimes how real progress actually gets made. Here's what tends to happen with stories like this one. The immediate noise fades. Both players move to the next game. Fans find a new controversy to pour their energy into. Another clip goes viral. Another argument dominates the timeline for 48 hours. And the specific details of a flagrant 2 foul during a mid-season Sky versus Fever matchup get buried under everything that comes after it. But the standard, the way people chose to talk about it, the way the league responded to it, the way athletes processed what happened publicly, that's the part that has a longer shelf life. Because every time a controversy like this one plays out, it either reinforces or erodes the norms around how these situations get handled. And the norms matter. They affect how players behave on the court. They affect what athletes think they can say publicly and what consequences they can expect. They affect whether fans develop the habit of thinking critically or the habit of reacting trivially.
And they affect whether the WNBA becomes the kind of league that handles its biggest moments with the seriousness they deserve. There's a version of this story where everyone involved comes out of it having learned something, where Carrington thinks harder about what she posts in emotional moments and what that costs her, where Cunningham continues navigating a complicated public position with the measured approach she showed here, where fans practice the discipline of separating what they know from what they feel, and where the league demonstrates through consistent action that its rules mean something regardless of who broke them or who they broke them against. That version of the story is possible. Whether it's the one that actually unfolds is a different question. But it starts with something simple, with all of us deciding that we're going to hold the moment to a real standard instead of a convenient one. Because Carrington will play again. Cunningham will play again. The WNBA will keep growing, keep attracting attention, and keep producing moments that push every conversation into the open. What we do with those moments, all of us, players, league, fans, and everyone watching from the sidelines, is what actually defines this era of the sport. And right now, the WNBA deserves better than easy conclusions drawn from 2-second clips and 2-word tweets. So, do you think the ejection was the right call? Do you think Carrington's post was an understandable reaction from a frustrated athlete, or did it do more damage than the foul ever could? And what does it say about the WNBA right now that one play between two players turned into a conversation the entire country was having within hours? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation isn't over, not even close.